Thank you so much for having me. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, any First Nations people here today. I too was born on Wurundjeri country and I continually return here to live and work. It is a place that I call home. I also call myself an earthling, and I say that very deliberately as a way of positioning myself in relation to my work and understanding how I'm connecting to planetary systems, how I'm connecting to bodies of water, but also how I'm a part of a bigger living system and what that might mean. So in terms of my work, when I talk about being an artist, a researcher, an explorer, I'm fundamentally concentrating on three things. One is experimentation, how we take something that we don't necessarily know, how we test it, how we pull it apart, how we ask questions, and we hope to act in a new way with the lessons that we learn. The next thing that I do is exhibit. So I'm really interested in how we share, whether that's through story or movement or performance or artifacts, how we exhibit, how we take notice of a place, its poetry, and its potential. The third thing that I do is explore. I'm driven by curiosity. I have a really high need for novelty, and I guess a belief, a strong-held belief that discovery nourishes us, that discovery leads to growth, that we are here to discover, to push those boundaries and limits. So my practice takes me across domains. When I'm talking about depth, I'm talking about depth in practical ways, but also in poetic ways. And I'm trying to look at the worlds that we inhabit, how we enter them, and how the worlds that we enter, in fact, enter us and create new experiences. So it's not always about going under, it might be about going up. So as part of my research, for example, I might be looking at going to altitude, I might be looking at flying. I might be looking at taking something of those spaces and understanding it internally, going deeper within that space through motion capture, through virtual reality, through peak performance analyses. But in doing so, I'm seeking certain things. So no matter the work, when I'm approaching the plan of a dive into experimentation, a dive into exhibition, a dive into exploration, I'm looking for what is, I would call, the jewel. What is it, that precious, sacred purpose, that elixir, that thing that I'm hoping to discover and find, that we keep at the surface, but we're going to take with us. I'm also not only looking for the jewels, but I'm looking for the tools. I need to understand what is going to be enabling, what is versatile, what I can take with me, and also what is disabling. I need to understand and map those tools as part of my dive planning. The other important question to ask is, of any mission as you're planning, in my case, often it's diving missions, it's, is my project, is my dive plan sufficiently radical? And is it sufficiently pragmatic? And the two balance each other out. So when we're talking about or thinking through how radical our project is, how radical our plan is, we have to account for risk. We have to account for the responsibilities that we have to honor the jewel, that mission purpose. And we also need to balance out the pragmatic responses that we have to understand if our tools are going to serve the purpose that they're intended. We need to know what is going to keep us buoyant and what is going to literally drown us or sink us. So I'm going to talk you through a little project called Project Moonwalk. I think this is a nice balance of that notion of going deep, but also going beyond. This was a human-robotic cooperation mission led underwater by the COMEX team in Marseille in France in 2016. So part of our planning on the surface, what has to occur on the surface, is that we as a crew, we need to both prepare for wild success. We also need to prepare for wild or mild deviation, let's hope, and to understand what is going to make us sink and fall. We also need to commit. We need to design and decide on the simultaneity of experiences and practices that are going to be part of this mission planning. And to describe that, we look at the design, we look at the mission architecture that includes the tools, the materials, the environment, the technique. But we also start to decide of the levels of connection with all of those elements. Because ultimately what we want to do is depart from the world that we know, depart from that surface. We need to be prepared to understand what we let go of and what we commit to. So we decide and we declare. So as we prepare on the surface, we're starting to think through what are the time-tasked technologies, what are the tasks and instruments, what are the techniques and tricks that I'm going to bring at certain intervals throughout my preparation. This is a time where I start to plan and reflect on training, and I start to look at the tools and technologies. I want to go through all of my systems and know that they are in a good state of operation. And I also want to be aware of myself and my own performance. Am I fit to dive? I need to constantly ask myself that. So how I prepare for this wild success, but also those deviations, means taking responsibility. It also means taking risks, balancing those risks. So the first part, committing to exiting. In this particular instance, I'm wearing the Gandolfi 2 simulation spacesuit, and we begin in a pool. We take that first plunge into a shallow water-controlled environment, into a pool. So here I'm egressing from a so-called lunar lander, and what we're doing here is simulating a mission on the far side of the moon in a darkened crater, underwater. So I'm not only wearing the dive suit, but I'm wearing underneath that a gesture-controlled suit so that my actions can command a little rover in concert with me. I'm also wearing a whole host of biometric systems measuring my body and my performance. Then I have communication systems, life support systems. Then I hop into a spacesuit and I do all of that entry in the water. I then symbolically egress from this lunar lander to commence my moonwalk. So in these instances, I'm still going through that process of designing, directing, deciding, understanding the layers of operation to the work that occurs underwater. So as I descend, I'm also going to take this controlled stop. I'm going to evaluate all of my systems, including the communications with my team. So this doesn't matter whether this is a literal dive or this is a project, business enterprise, a social enterprise. Take time for a controlled stop in a controlled environment to test, to analyze, to look at your preparedness as you commit to descend. So in this instance, we are again in the pool with the lights on. It is daylight now. And we can look at our operational procedures, we can understand the tricks, and I can bring some of my personality to this project. This is working with a consortium of amazing researchers from across Europe with funding from the European Commission. So there's 8 project partners, and I have comms lines with all of them. In addition to that, my activities are being monitored by the same mission control people who are working with the crews at the International Space Station. They are great multitaskers. So we go through all of our checks. As we start to compress, we're compressing our training, we're compressing everything that we've learned. We're putting it into practice. And we're going back because there's a sensory overload of systems. So we're going back to the tools, the tricks, the time-tasked training maneuvers, and the techniques that we have learnt. We're a little bit like autopilot, but we have a target, usually a bottom target. So in so much of our life and our business, we're often looking to ascend. In this case, we're looking to descend. We're looking to go deeper. We're looking to go to a place of neutral buoyancy, of positive pressure. So when we reach the bottom, if you like, we can begin to explore. We can begin to be truly present. We can, in a way, it's a safe space, but it's also a space that has a designated time. All of your training and all of your preparation has gone into that moment. This is what you've worked towards. This space. Some people talk about flow, they talk about a high, they talk about a rhythm, they talk about that amazing environment where it all comes together. You're putting into practice your art, your exploration, your mission, and you're discovering new things. I talk about sometimes the rapture of a deep as existing, but something at depth, when we're truly at depth, is a moment, a precious moment in time. This is my jewel that I take with me, is that understanding that the body can dissolve in that space, the ego can dissolve in that space. I become, I guess, part of a body of water. Myself is somehow concentrated or consecrated by the body of water, and it consecrates me. So I have a larger sense of not only how I'm performing, but of what my presence is and what the phenomena is around me. And I try to be as open as possible to new discovery, recognizing the details that are unremarkable as well as remarkable. And I'll explain why later. But being permeable, being open to receiving something of a new experience at depth so that you can ascend. So some people, when we talk about going to depth, think of a dark place. It's not always positive pressure. There can be a temptation to think of it as murky, as dangerous, as a point towards death. Let's be honest. In this case, physically, but also poetically or phenomenologically, people don't always trust themselves to descend and go deeper, to be vulnerable, to be exposed, to be at high risk. But there's also something really beautiful in that space, those moments, particularly if you're prepared to ascend again, if you're prepared to come back to the surface with that knowledge. And as part of this process, we need to decompress. We need to take calculated safety stops. We need to level out. We need to take time for, literally, in the diving case, for these nitrogen bubbles to leave our body. What has been compressed into our body, we need it to leave. But we can start to ascend to share in that experience, to share in something of the understanding of that moment in time where we've entered a new world, where we have become something else. We've become aqueous. We have become a body of water. And the debrief process is just as important. So a good experiment compared to a bad experiment is when you know the outcome, you don't really need to experiment. Or if you don't know the outcome, but you're not prepared to act on the outcomes of your experiment, that's not necessarily a good experiment either. What is a good experiment is that which you don't know, that you test and try, and you are willing and prepared to act on as a result of the outcomes. And in that, it starts to feed a loop. You can then create a new arc, a new art. You can start to adapt and implement and adopt some of the lessons that are learnt in the discoveries of your design or your dive. So this is a little clip that shows you something of Project Moonwalk and how experimentation, exploration, and exhibition.
The analog simulation site of Rio Tinto with the analog simulations in Marseille, and also with lab testings. So we are trying to find out what do we get out of doing analog simulations and comparing robot and astronaut procedures.
The subsea landscape near Marseille was selected to represent the lunar surface. Here, scenarios were conducted in an even more complex way. The suit port, the rover, and all of the equipment had to be installed underwater before the astronaut could enter the suit.
All the moonwalk elements, such as the procedures, the tools, the suit port, but also the gesture-controlled rover, can be part of future space activities, space missions on the Moon and on Mars. And to advance Europe's capabilities, all these are important to prepare and train astronauts for these future missions.
In the future, we will be able to produce a new iteration of our human-machine interface, and we can come up with new concepts of operations that can make this work more effective. And of course, we would like that our hardware becomes flight ready, and that once Europe or anybody wants to go to Mars or to the Moon, we will be able to have the hardware ready and useful for the tasks that are needed.
Project Moonwalk takes us one step further into the future of human space exploration, pairing humankind and technology to transcend known boundaries.
So this was one of my favorite projects, and it was also an opportunity for me to step out of the exploration environment, the experimentation environment, and bring that to an audience to look at how I would exhibit or translate some of that experience. So I was able to design a program called the Agency of Human Robotic Lunatics to share in something of the personal experience of going through that mission. So using, again, a gesture-controlled system on a stage and working in cooperation with a robot, in this case the Cinema Swarm robot, my gestures and interactions produced an avatar, another embodied version of myself, working and being able to describe what it was like to go into the pool scenario, what it was like, in fact, to transcend the physical world and to enter what absolutely had to become an imaginative space beyond. I also needed to simultaneously not only work with the practical teams on the diving operations and the space operations and the simulated operations, but I also needed to switch off from being a commercial diver and absolutely be the embodied artist. And I had to visualize and imagine and be an astronaut on the lunar surface. And translate something of addition to that, so we come out of this phase and we go into these debriefing phases where we learn to design, to adapt, to create new art. But we also want to look at opportunities for sharing. There is a bit of a joke, how do you know if there's a commercial diver in a hotel? Don't worry, they'll tell you. It's really similar. Like one of the beautiful things that we can do in a debriefing phase is not only go through what worked, what didn't work, what we're going to adapt, adopt, and so on, how we're going to plan for the future, but we can also look retrospectively. I had the great privilege in 2020, unfortunately we were preparing a subsea habitat mission to mark the 50th anniversary of the first all-women subsea habitat crew, with one of the original founders, Dr. Sylvia Earle, my hero, my shiro. However, we had a bit of a pandemic, and also there was a hurricane that had impacted the Aquarius Reef laboratory. So instead we pivoted and we created TechTite 2020, which we got 100 women of sea and space to speak in celebration over 2 or 3 days. And we had the great privilege of not only looking back at that milestone mission, but gathering the original crew together for the first time since the historic mission. And when I say it's really important at depth to pick up the nuances of what you find remarkable and unremarkable, just note that in time, that will change. And what you thought was unremarkable once might become remarkable later, and vice versa. So just be mindful of the two. Here are some closing words.
You have a responsibility, and that constantly aware. It's not about you, Sylvia. It's about the ocean. And when you speak, so they want to know: did you use a hairdryer? Or did you wear lipstick? Okay, get over that. Let me tell you about the ocean and what it is that we saw there. So it was an opening to really communicate on a scale that was unprecedented. For me, it also led to other
discoveries. So we also concluded with a preeminent, I guess, woman in space, and that is a former director, the emeritus director of the SETI Institute, who left with, in reflection, a beautiful...
is that when you get back to your devices, go in and change your profile so that the first thing that you say about yourself is that you're an earthling, and then act like it. Thank you.
Thank you.